The most irresponsible thing you can do is not quit without a plan. It is stay in a place that is slowly taking everything from you. Because there is a version of this story that nobody tells. The person who handed in no notice, gave no warning, left no forwarding address for their professional reputation. They were not reckless. Maybe you have sat in a car in the office car park, not because you were early, but because your body would not cooperate, because something in you could not make the walk from the car to the front door without a few minutes of just sitting there alone, gathering what it took to perform one more day. Maybe you know what it is like to dread a Sunday, not because the week ahead is busy, but because you have stopped believing anything about the week ahead will get better. People who quit without giving 2 weeks' notice are not a cautionary tale. They are a psychological profile. And understanding that profile might tell you more about the modern workplace than any management book ever will. That is what this video is about. Psychology refers to this moment as a threshold crossing. It is the point at which the accumulated weight of unmet needs, repeated disappointments, and psychological depletion finally exceeds a person's capacity to continue performing what feels like a role they no longer believe in. In plain terms, they did not snap. They did not have a bad day and make an impulsive decision. They ran out of reasons to stay. And that is a very different thing. Let us break down exactly who these people are and what was actually happening to them long before they walked out the door. Here is something most people do not understand about sudden resignations. They are almost never sudden. By the time someone walks out without notice, they have typically already left the job in their head. Weeks, sometimes months, before their body follows. Psychologists call this psychological withdrawal. The person is still physically present, still showing up, still attending meetings, but internally they have already detached. They have stopped caring about the outcome of projects. They treat feedback as background noise. They have mentally moved on. They are simply waiting for the right moment or the courage to make it official. Research from organizational psychology shows that employees who eventually leave without notice report an average of 4 to 5 months of disengagement before their resignation, during which most managers notice nothing unusual. That is not impulsiveness. That is endurance. That is someone holding on far longer than anyone around them knew. During those months of withdrawal, there are usually clear signals. They stop volunteering ideas in meetings. They go quiet on group chats. They take slightly longer to reply to emails. They start leaving exactly on time when they used to stay late. Their energy, which was once available to the organization, quietly withdraws to where it is needed most, keeping them functional. But in most workplaces, nobody asks. Nobody checks in. The silence is mistaken for contentment or simply overlooked in the noise of everything else happening. And so the gap between the person and the organization grows wider, with no bridge built on either side. Researchers who study workplace exits have found something consistent. The incident that finally causes someone to quit without notice is almost never proportional to the action it triggers. It might be a dismissive comment in a meeting, a performance review that felt unfair, an email CC'd to someone it should not have been, a task dropped into the inbox at 5:58 on a Friday. The incident itself is minor, but it lands on top of everything that came before it. Every unaddressed grievance, every overlooked contribution, every time they swallowed something they wanted to say. Psychologists call this the last straw phenomenon. No single straw breaks anything. It is the accumulation, and the final piece simply reveals the weight that was already there. Here is the part that surprises people. Many employees who quit without notice are not the disengaged ones. They are often among the most values-driven people in the organization. Their decision to leave abruptly frequently comes from a deep conviction that staying away, going through the rituals of a professional departure for an environment they believe is fundamentally broken, would itself be a form of dishonesty. To them, giving 2 weeks of performed dedication to a place that violated their values feels like its own kind of lie. This is not rationalization. Psychological research on workplace ethics consistently finds that employees with high integrity scores are more likely to make clean, complete exits when they finally leave. Because the idea of half leaving, of pretending to care during a notice period, feels more wrong to them than the abruptness of simply going. The person who quit without notice often spent far more time thinking about whether it was right than the person who gave 2 weeks and spent those 2 weeks mentally checked out anyway. Think about what a 2-week notice period actually requires of someone who has reached that threshold. It requires attending meetings about projects they will never see completed, giving feedback they know will not be implemented, performing enthusiasm and engagement for an audience they no longer believe in a building where something broke and nobody fixed it. For most people in that psychological state, that is not a small ask. It is 2 weeks of sustained emotional performance with no personal return. For people whose primary relationship with their work was always built on meaning rather than transaction, 2 weeks of performance in that condition is genuinely impossible. Here is something the professional conversation almost never includes. By the time most people reach a no-notice resignation, the damage was not only psychological, it was physical. Psychologists use the term allostatic load to describe the cumulative wear and tear on the body from chronic stress. When the body's stress response is activated constantly, not occasionally, not in short bursts, but every single day as a baseline, it stops being a response. It becomes your new normal. Elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep, a weakened immune system. Research published in the Journal of Occupational Health Psychology found that employees experiencing chronic workplace stress carry a significantly elevated risk of cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, and clinical depression. The person who quit without notice was not being dramatic when they said the job was killing them. The physiology agrees. If you have ever sat in your car in the car park for 20 minutes before going inside, not because you were early, but because you were not ready, you already understand this psychology more than you think. That pause before you walk through the door is not weakness. It is the gap between who you are and who the building needs you to be. And the longer that gap grows, the more energy it costs every single day just to cross it. You have already felt the weight this video is describing. The only question is how long you have been carrying it, and whether the people around you ever noticed. Every person who has ever stayed at a difficult job has done an unconscious cost-benefit calculation. The pain of staying is still less than the uncertainty of leaving. For most people, most of the time, that calculation holds. The financial security, the professional reputation, the discomfort of the unknown, these outweigh the dissatisfaction. So, they stay. But for people who quit without notice, something in that equation permanently shifts. The cost of staying, to their self-respect, their physical health, their sense of who they are, crosses a line where no external benefit can compensate for it anymore. Psychologists describe this as the risk inversion point, the moment when staying feels more dangerous than leaving. Once that point is crossed, the 2-week notice period is not a professional courtesy being abandoned. It is 14 more days of damage, and for many of them, that is simply not a trade they can make. One of the strongest predictors of a no-notice resignation is the collapse of psychological safety, the belief that you can speak honestly in this environment without punishment. When psychological safety breaks down, employees stop raising concerns, stop flagging problems, stop asking for what they need. Not because those needs disappear, but because they have learned through experience that expressing them leads nowhere good. Over time, the gap between what they need and what they are getting silently widens, with no channel to close it. By the time someone reaches a no-notice departure, they typically believe, often correctly, that no formal conversation would change anything. The absence of notice is often the absence of any remaining belief that communication in this environment serves a purpose. Most organizations respond to sudden resignations by asking what went wrong at the end. They conduct exit interviews when the person has already left or when the trust required for an honest answer has long since evaporated. What they should be asking is what was going wrong in the middle. Because the exit without notice is never the problem. It is the evidence of a problem that was present and visible and unaddressed for months, and that nobody chose to look at directly. The person who quit without warning gave warnings. They just did not come in the form anyone was listening for. The most common reaction to a no-notice resignation from employers, from the person's network, is that they have burned bridges, that references are gone, that future hiring managers will see it and think twice. And sometimes that is true. Some industries are small and professional reputation matters. But the psychological literature on career transitions tells a more complicated story. People who make clean, definitive exits, even abrupt ones, often enter their next role with greater clarity about what they need, stronger boundaries about what they will not accept, and a more honest sense of their own limits. The rupture, as uncomfortable as it is for everyone, frequently functions as a reset, a full stop, a moment that finally forces the person to reckon with something they had been quietly managing for far too long. Research tracking employees who resigned without completing a notice period found that within 12 months, the majority reported higher job satisfaction, stronger alignment between their values and their work, and in many cases improved compensation compared to what they were earning when they left. The conventional wisdom says that quitting without notice closes doors. The data suggests something more nuanced. When the environment someone left was genuinely misaligned with who they are, the abruptness of leaving often does less long-term damage than staying and continuing to erode. Studies show that 67% of employees who left without notice reported higher satisfaction scores within 12 months, compared to 41% of those who stayed in the same role. There is a consistent personality profile that emerges across people who resign this way. They tend to be highly conscientious, which might seem contradictory given the perception of their exit. But their conscientiousness is directed inward, toward their own values and standards, rather than outward toward the organization's expectations. They tend to have a strong sense of personal integrity, a lower tolerance for situations that feel dishonest or misaligned, and a higher sensitivity to environments where trust is broken down. They are also frequently high in what psychologists call emotional perceptiveness. They feel the dynamics of a workplace acutely, register small shifts in tone and treatment, and carry those experiences internally rather than expressing them, which means the things that eventually broke the relationship were almost always felt and held privately, long before they became the reason someone left. There is a distinction worth drawing, Price, between people who quit without notice as a considered act of self-preservation and people who leave impulsively out of anger and later regret it. The people this video has been describing are largely the former. The decision was quick in its execution but not in its formation. The thought had been building for months. The exit was decisive, not reactive. The difference matters because the psychological outcome differs too. People who leave as a form of escape from acute conflict often carry that conflict with them. People who leave because they finally gave themselves permission to stop enduring, they tend to put it down much more completely. From the manager's perspective, a no-notice resignation often registers as a personal betrayal. The absence of professional courtesy is read as aggression, or as evidence that the person was never committed in the first place. But in the vast majority of cases, the commitment was real. The relationship was real. And the breakdown that led to the exit was not the absence of care, it was the absence of repair. Something cracked, and nobody reached across to close it. The exit without notice is frequently the end result of a relationship that both sides allowed to deteriorate, and that only one side is being asked to account for. People who have made this decision often describe the moment of final resolution in remarkably similar terms, not as anger, not as relief, not yet, as a kind of stillness, a moment where the noise of every reason to stay and every fear of leaving goes quiet, and they simply know, with a clarity that feels unfamiliar precisely because most of their working life had been spent managing noise and managing other people's comfort, managing the gap between what was asked of them and what they could realistically give. And in that stillness, sometimes in a car, sometimes in the middle of a meeting, sometimes at 2 a.m, they make the decision, not dramatically, quietly, with the same private internal resolve that characterized everything they did in that workplace from the beginning. In most of these cases, the exit did not have to happen. not because the person was wrong to leave, but because the conditions that made leaving necessary were not inevitable. A single honest conversation at the right moment could have changed the trajectory. A manager who noticed the withdrawal and asked about it directly. A workplace culture where expressing dissatisfaction did not feel professionally dangerous. A moment where the person's private experience was made visible and taken seriously, instead of remaining invisible until it became a resignation. The 2-week notice they did not give is not the thing that needed fixing. The environment that made honest communication feel impossible. That is where this story actually started. If you are watching this and you recognize your own situation in it, or if the car park, the hollow meetings, the weight of it all sounds familiar, a few things are worth being clear about. The length of time you have stayed is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of something in you that kept hoping it would get better. That hope is not a flaw. The clarity you feel when you finally let go of that hope is not recklessness. It is information. It is your own judgment finally unclouded by the obligation to manage someone else's comfort at the expense of your own. And whatever you decide, to stay and address it honestly or to leave and move forward, doing it in the way that is most true to what you actually need is always the right place to start. The 2-week notice period exists to serve the organization's continuity. It is a professional norm built on the assumption that the relationship between employer and employee remained functional to its end. For the people this video has been about, that assumption had already failed, quietly, privately, over months that nobody witnessed. What they needed was rarely a better exit process. It was an environment where they never had to reach the exit at all. The most important question this video leaves you with is not whether someone owed their employer 2 weeks. It is whether the environment they were in was one where honest communication was possible at all, and if not, whose responsibility it was to build one. People who quit without giving 2 weeks' notice are not reckless. They are not unprofessional by nature. They are people who reach the end of their psychological capacity to maintain a performance they no longer believed in a place that had stopped meeting them halfway. Understanding this does not mean every sudden exit is right. It means the real story of why people leave this way is almost always longer, quieter, and more human than the 2-sentence explanation that ends up in the exit interview, if there is one at all. If this resonated with you, whether you stayed, left, or are still deciding, subscribe. The psychology of your workplace is worth understanding, and that is exactly what this channel is here for.